Thank you so much, Christine, and it must be strange for you to be yet again back in the NEU head office like you never went away, and what a fantastic General Secretary you were, and what a brilliant member of the House of Lords you are. Christine, like the others that I appointed to the House of Lords, had to come and sit across my desk and say, yes, I will vote to abolish the House of Lords at every opportunity that comes up. And she did, of course. Because she was put there in order to speak up for a more democratic society. I want to say a big thank you to all those that have organised tonight's event. I know there's been a huge amount of effort put into this, and whilst the audience in here is of a reasonable size, the fact that we're live streaming it and taking a video of it will mean it will reach a much wider audience as well. And I do think that as a point of principle, our movement should always try to do hybrid meetings because it means that everyone gets some access to it. And I want to say thank you so much to those that have come along this evening, to our wonderful friend Barbara, Excellency Barbara, Ambassador of Cuba, thank you so much for being here tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here. To Steve and to Alex, thank you so much for coming along. And thank you to Maggie Bowden for all her years as General Secretary of Liberation, but also for letting me loose on her bookshelves when I last visited her flat. She said, take anything you like. It was, well, I would have done, except Laura was with me, and she limits me to no more than 10 new books a week in our house, but she's away at the moment, so she's not watching this, so there's already 30 come in the past week. So Maggie, thank you so much for that and for everything. And to Roger, your introduction is brilliant, and your work in unison, your work as a trade unionist is absolutely brilliant, and what you're now doing in the Morning Star. And I think the last point you made is a very important one, because it speaks volumes for you and for all of us in this room, and particularly for Fenner Brockway. He didn't see internationalism as an add-on to his life, or something he did on Thursdays and Fridays, and the other days he did other things. He saw the struggles of the working class in this country, the struggles of the communities he represented both in Leighton and later in Eton and Slough, and the struggles of people against colonialism, imperialism and exploitation as part of the same struggle. And we all should see it that way. It's not an either or. You have to take on all these causes, and acts of solidarity to people in a desperate colonial situation, as I'm going to explain later on, actually matter. And that's what liberation was founded to achieve. And so tonight, I think it's right that, if I may, I could start by just referring to the last Liberation Journal that was printed as part of the Morning Star, in which Herseth pointed out the need for education and understanding. And that is a theme that I think we've got to all pick up. The world in which we live has never been easier to communicate with each other, and never been harder to find out what's going on, because we're directed into what we should know and directed at what we shouldn't know. And so it is important that we deal with these things. I knew Fenner Brockway, and I was always delighted because right up to his dying day, he always called me young man. So, you know, to me, Fenner could absolutely do no wrong in always calling me young man. And I've got some very fond memories of Fenner. The most beautiful memory is only 3 or 4 months before he died. He was in the House of Commons having a cup of tea with Tony Benn in the cafeteria. And I was there with my oldest son, Ben, who was then about 6 months old and was frankly being a complete pain. And I was having difficulty keeping Ben quiet and entertained. And Fenner said, why don't you let him sit on my lap? Great. You know, it's like you've got a small baby and anybody offers to hold it. Yeah, right, you're away, here you go. So baby Ben, who was then quite a big baby Ben, he's very big now, went and sat on Fenner's lap. Then Tony Benn appeared, Tony Benn kindly put his pipe to one side and he said, "Let me feed him." So there was this magic moment of Ben sitting on Fenner's lap being fed by Tony Benn. And one of the catering staff then said, "I wished I'd had a camera for that magic moment," because it was, to me personally, a very magic moment. Fenner's life was fascinating. He was born in Calcutta, then part of British India, and was sent to Britain to go to school in the early part of the 20th century, and became a socialist and a vegetarian at roughly the same time, well before the First World War, and became involved in opposition to the First World War, and then eventually became editor of the Labour Leader. And during that time, he was proved to be a brilliant writer, proved to be a brilliant organiser of the Anti-Conscription League, was charged with, I think, probably sedition in 1914 for opposing, conscription hadn't quite happened at that stage, but opposing the very idea of it, and obviously opposing the First World War. Won that case and was then charged again a year later and was imprisoned. Imprisoned in a series of prisons around Britain as a conscientious objector, as somebody that opposed the First World War. And his greatest days were actually in the Majesty's Prison in Walton, in Liverpool, interestingly, because that is a place where so many good comrades have been imprisoned at various times, including those that opposed the First World War. And he was kept in solitary confinement most of the time because they realised that he had great oratorical abilities and would influence other prisoners. And so he then hit on the idea of a prison newspaper. Now, this wasn't some kind of liberal prison run by the Home Office in order for prisoners to educate themselves and better themselves. This was a very strict, very harsh regime. And so his idea of the prison newspaper was that he would use the toilet paper to write whatever news he had heard of, overheard conversations, prison officers and so on, about the First World War, opposition to it and so on, and hide it behind the toilet cistern. Then the next prisoner who came in would know it's there, take it out and add anything else they knew. And so over a period of time, this roll of toilet paper on sheets got longer and longer, and they all managed to inform themselves. And it was quite a long time before the prison authorities found out about this and, of course, punished all those that had done it. He was somebody that was very brave and suffered, as indeed were all those conscientious objectors in the First World War. There was no liberal establishment looking out for their rights of free speech. They were brutally treated, mostly put in solitary confinement, often put on really hard graft labour gangs and things like that. And Fenner Brockway was very much part of that. He then obviously came out of prison at the end of the war, and his life then resumed all the political activities that he'd always done, and opposed the rearmament proposals and supported the principles behind the Russian Revolution, but he was part of that very intense debate of that period, and I'll come back to that in a moment. He became the MP for Leighton in 1929. He was MP for 2 years until MacDonald's treachery against the Labour government led to the introduction of the national government in 1931, the election in which Labour was almost wiped out. Fenner Brockway lost his seat at that time, and then spent the 1930s with many others opposing the rise of fascism, but at the same time looking for a peaceful future and supporting the Spanish Republic, because he felt that the Spanish Republican struggle was actually, in reality, a struggle against the rise of the Nazis. He was, of course, completely correct about that. And so Fenner's life was all of those kind of things. And he opposed the Second World War as a conscientious objector, but also spent quite a lot of time supporting the Indian independence cause. After all, he had been born in India, and throughout the 1930s did all of that. And then, post-war, he was elected to Parliament again in 1950 for Slough. And Slough was a place where many people from the Punjab came and made their homes in Britain. And Fenner was obviously their voice, obviously speaking up against racism, helped to found anti-racist campaigns, and stand up against the brutality and the racism that newly arrived, in this case workers from the Punjab, received in exactly the same way that Afro-Caribbean people received the same kind of abuse in West Midlands or in London. So he was absolutely an advance guard of the anti-racist movement within our society. But he always believed in the creativity of founding organisations that would speak out on things and take up causes. And so, in impressive array of three major organisations he was instrumental in founding in the 1950s. The first was War on Want in 1950. It was occasioned by a book that Harold Wilson wrote called The War on Want. This was after Wilson had resigned from the Labour government over the Korean War, rearmament and introduction of health service charges. And that led to the foundation of War on Want by Wilson, yes, Fenner Brockway, and a fine man called Frank Harcourt Munning in Ealing, who was a great friend of my grandfather, who helped them set up War on Want at that time. And War on Want has stuck exactly to what it was set up to do: speak up against colonialism, against imperialism, and in acts of solidarity with trade unions and working class organisations all around the world. And it's a pleasure to see Asad Rehman and all the great work he does as General Secretary of War on Want. So that was one aspect of what Fenner was doing as a Member of Parliament. He was also totally instrumental in the founding of the Movement for Colonial Freedom in 1954. He and Tony Benn particularly, but there were others involved, were crucial in the founding of it, because they could see that whilst India had achieved its independence at the price of partition, and the human price of partition was millions dead, he wanted us to be in solidarity with those struggling for independence of colonies all around the world. And I'll come back to this in a moment, because the role of the Labour Party wasn't always quite as good as many historical observations claim it to have been. So his foundation was there in it. And I just remember in the days when Fenner was around speaking at Movement Colonial Freedom events. And I just remember him going to an event in Highbury one afternoon in somebody's garden, and he made a wonderful, very long speech, to the extent the neighbours were disturbed by his speech, and you could see them poking their head over the wall. And then they decided they quite liked it, so they then got step ladders to go up the edge of the wall and look over and actually see what was going on. Fenner was somebody that was always active and always a voice for peace and a voice for justice. And he was also involved crucially, and this was absolutely crucial at the time, was 1957, the foundation of CND in the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, along with Michael Foot, Bertrand Russell, and a whole lot of others, because again, he saw the danger to the survival humanity of the British H-bomb at the time, and then the development of a whole new generation of nuclear weapons. And so, if he did nothing else in his life, just being instrumental in the formation of those three organisations deserves, I think, a huge mention. He lost his election to be a Member of Parliament at Slough in the 1964 election. Now, those of you of my age and so on will remember that 1964 was a successful election for Labour. They overturned a Tory majority of 100, and there was a majority of about 4, I think, an overall majority of 4. And there were 2 seats that Labour lost. They gained many more, of course. They lost in Smethwick with overtly racist campaign run by the Tories against the Labour candidate Patrick Gordon Walker, who was very much on the right of the Labour Party. He was Foreign Affairs spokesperson. And Fenner lost in Eton and Slough on an equally racist campaign against him because of the support and solidarity he had shown to the Indian workers that had moved into his constituency. So he lost his seat there, which was devastating. And I remember some commentary about it at the time, particularly from my mother, who was very upset about him losing. But Wilson appointed him to the House of Lords, where he did an incredible job, all for the rest of his life, and used the platform in the way it should be used. And I remember Fenner coming to Islington to open the Philip Noel Baker Peace Garden in probably about 1984. He also was a prolific writer, and he wrote a novel called The Purple Ship, and I can't find a copy of this book anywhere. But apparently it's a kind of antidote to Lord of the Flies. You know, Lord of the Flies is sort of these boys get together on an island and all become monsters and try and kill each other and so on and so on. It's not a very nice book, but interesting. His book is the opposite. It's a group of people that were on a cruise ship where a plague hit them, a bit like COVID, and it was tied up somewhere in an island off an ocean, probably the Indian Ocean, not sure, because I can't get the book. They then had to sort of make do. Somebody must have provided them with food, otherwise they'd have all died. And this developed from being a hierarchical cruise ship with officers and ratings and so on the staff side of the ship, and first class, second class, third class and steerage passengers amongst the passengers. It became a socialist republic ship. And so in his imagination, this ship was an example about how humanity, in adversity, can work together to create a just and socialist society. And I'm pretty sure that Tony Benn's story, which he often told us about the socialist train, must have come from reading of that book. So, but I'm going to look into this a bit further. And so I think we should be grateful to Fenner for all that he did in his life. And it's, to me, an enormous honour to be able to give what is the first Fenner Brockway Memorial Lecture. I don't think all the others are going to be solely about Fenner. This isn't solely about Fenner, but I think it's important. We should try and understand the life that he led, the abuse that he received from the mainstream media in this country, and the way he was never bowed by it. He always gloried in the solidarity that he got from the working class communities he represented, just as much as he did from people in other countries and trade unionists in various colonies around the world. And I think it's important, if I may, just to explore for a moment the crucial issues about internationalism and international solidarity in the labour movement. Because in the latter part of the 19th century, amongst European trade unionists, it was a sort of given that you had to be internationalist. It was a given that capital was becoming more international and more global, and that capital was becoming very, very powerful in the Industrial Revolution, the way people were treated in factories, and so on. And it also was a given that the trade union movement wanted to be opposed to wars. Remember, many members of unions had been former soldiers, had been in colonial wars, had lost many of their comrades in those wars. And so the growth of this European-wide peace movement was very significant. And the alliances that Keir Hardie, Juarez, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and others built up across Europe was a serious and very powerful anti-war movement. And Keir Hardie, 1907, went on a world tour by ship. I mean, those days there was a very long parliamentary recess, but it must have been a very, very long one to go on a world tour by ship. But he went to the United States, he went to Canada, he went to Australia, he went to India, he went to South Africa. And when he came back, they had a sort of welcome home rally at the Royal Albert Hall. And I was sent a lovely gift of somebody 2 years ago, sent me this gift of the programme in absolutely mint condition of the homecoming rally of Keir Hardie. He was given an hour to an hour and a half for his speech, including opening remarks. And the whole thing was timed to run from 6 until 11 in the evening. So it was a pretty big show. And then I later managed to get a copy of the speech that he gave. What a speech! Opposing racism, opposing what were then the remnants of the slave trade and the racism in the United States, opposing what was the latent apartheid system in South Africa, and opposing British occupation of India. And do you know what paper condemned him? The Daily Mail. The Daily Mail front page headlines about this evil man, Keir Hardie, and all that he was doing. And so there was that sense of unity. There was that massive movement against the rush to develop the weaponry and the First World War, which finally broke out in 1914. And this was the problem for the left. Keir Hardie spoke at a rally in Trafalgar Square against the First World War on the eve of its declaration. And it was a huge crowd, massive support and so on. He then, 1 or 2 days later, spoke in Parliament as leader of the opposition against the First World War, which had then been declared. The xenophobia had already taken over and gripped people. And his speech was silenced by some, probably quite a lot, of Labour MPs humming, then singing the national anthem to drown out their party leader who was opposing the war. And so Keir Hardie then went on a campaign against the First World War, Anti-Conscription League and so on, and eventually died of a heart attack in 1915. Those people that warned against the First World War and the millions that died in it, I think, are people that should be revered and remembered. But that was, in a sense, a turning point in the Labour movement in Britain. I'm not talking just about the Labour Party, I'm talking about the whole Labour movement there, in which the leaderships of the party, not Ramsay MacDonald, interestingly, but he committed crimes later on, joined in with the Tories and formed that coalition government which lasted for the duration of the war. And I think ever since that time, there's been a very fundamental debate in the Labour movement about national interest versus international. And I think that debate is as relevant today as it ever was, as we now have a world dominated by a very small number of very powerful global corporations who are quite happy to pay ducks and drakes with labour movement rules and labour regulations all around the world. That period was also, of course, dominated by the end of the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Red Rising in Bavaria, Red Clydeside, and all of the huge industrial unrest of the 1918, 19, 20, 21 period. And the attitude that the British Labour movement should take towards the Russian Revolution. The Leeds Conference in 1919 was attended by a huge range of people in solidarity with the Russian Revolution at that time, and the Communist Party was founded in 1920. Lenin's wish, and many others, was the Communist Party should join in with the Labour Party. Indeed, he fell out with Sylvia Pankhurst about that, because she challenged him at the Comintern in 1920. She said, Comrade Vladimir Ilyich, you really don't want to be associated with the bunch of bureaucrats I've been fighting in the Labour Party all these years. And, you might recognise some of this language. And the split, in a sense, went on from that point. And I think it's important to analyse what happened then, because sometimes these historical changes last a very long time. Now, I've got immense respect for what the post-war Labour government achieved in this country. I've got total respect for them. The National Health Service, council housing, planning, public ownership, planned economy, full employment, rights at work, and so much more was achieved in 6 quite short years by a reforming zeal of that government. And nothing should be taken away from them in that respect. However, on the international stage and international reckoning, it was rather different. In 1930, Clement Attlee, as leader of the opposition, was appointed by Tony Benn's father to be a member of the Simon Commission, which went to India to discuss the possibility of Dominion status or something like that as a future for India. And this was strongly opposed by Gandhi and the Congress Party in India. The British troops killed protesters, went on a rampage against them for protesting against the presence of the Simon Commission, and Attlee was totally with the Simon Commission. He thought this was the right way forward for India, and whilst he did later support independence for India, that point in history is, I think, not a particularly credible one. And then if we move on to the post-war period, this is a point that to me is absolutely fascinating, because I've never fully understood how it is that so many Labour MPs, brilliant Labour MPs, many from working class communities and trade union backgrounds, were very strong on how they would reform society, trade union rights, workers' rights, health service, housing, all those crucial issues that were achieved, and largely so silent on international issues. And this to me is absolutely shocking, because at the end of the Second World War, a Labour government was elected, and the theory was the troops would all come home. Those stationed in India who'd been on the Burma campaign or stationed in Malaya after the defeat of Japan did not come home. A whole contingent was sent to Vietnam in order not to ensure the independence of colonial Indochina from France, but sent there to defeat the Viet Minh, who were trying to declare an independent republic of Vietnam at that time. And they then waited long enough and held the Viet Minh back long enough for the French, who had recently been liberated from Nazi occupation, to send their own forces to Vietnam. And Japanese prisoners of war were used as part of the forces to defeat the Viet Minh under the authority of Ernie Bevin and others in that government. And to me, it's a sort of shocking revelation of history that happened. Indonesia was also then a Dutch colony, and of course the Netherlands had recently been liberated again from Nazi occupation. The British forces went there in order to defend the colonial possession of Indonesia against the growth of the national movements there. And they, again, I'm going to quote here, if I may, from a very interesting book written by John Newsinger, The Blood That Never Died, and it goes on about the confrontation in Indonesia. In Surabaya, the British were confronted by a large, well-armed nationalist militia that possessed tanks, artillery and anti-aircraft guns seized from the Japanese. The British commander, Brigadier Malaby, assured the nationalists that he had no intention of disarming them or restoring the Dutch. The agreement was promptly repudiated by Malaby's superiors in London, who had no idea of the situation he faced. On the 28th of October, Malaby's 4,000 troops came under attack from 22,000 Indonesians, with a hostile population solidly behind them. A number of British positions were overrun with heavy losses, and Sukarno was flown into the city to negotiate a ceasefire. This broke down almost immediately. British troops were besieged in a bank in Internato Square, and Malaby himself went to investigate. After he arrived, the troops opened fire, and in the confusion, he was killed. It then goes on to describe how the British won the position back by arming the Japanese prisoners of war with British weapons in order to defeat the Indonesian nationalists who were fighting with Japanese weapons, to the extent that one of the British officers then recommended one of the Japanese officers who had, in his view, performed gallantly on behalf of the British in defeating the Indonesian nationalists for a medal to be given by the royal family in London. The hypocrisy of it, of using Japanese prisoners of war to defeat those who wanted independence for Indonesia. Obviously, eventually independence was achieved in Vietnam, partly in 1954 and later in 1976. But with the loss of millions of lives on the way. And so I think it's important to remember those things. And that was sadly done under a Labour government. Likewise, the disaster, and it was a disaster, of Malaya, where there was the massacre, which is still under investigation, of nationalist forces in Malaya that were trying to gain independence from Malaya after the war, and the British were determined to hang on to it because Malaya was a precious colony, a huge dollar earner within the world because of its production of rubber and palm oil, and the treatment of nationalist forces and the massacre of them was absolutely horrendous. I've got a note on time, so I'll be very quick. Fast forward a little bit to the 1950s, and this is where Fenner and others came in, was the situation in Kenya. Kenya had always been a British colony that was destined to be almost the equivalent of South Africa. It was designated as a place for settlement, white settlement in Kenya, the White Highlands, the land question, and so on, in the same way that South Africa was, whereas Uganda was very, very different. There was very little settlement in Uganda by comparison. And the Mau Mau fighters were fighting back against this, and the treatment of them was unbelievably awful. I quote here from the historian Robert Edgerson, who provides a graphic portrait of police methods in Kenya in the 1950s. It's a question. If a question was not answered to the interrogator's satisfaction, the subject was beaten and kicked. If that did not lead to the desired confession, and it rarely did, more force was applied. Electric shocks were widely used, and so was fire. Women were choked and held under water. Gun barrels, beer bottles, and even knives were thrust into the vaginas. Men had beer bottles thrust up their rectums, were dragged behind Land Rovers, whipped, burned, and bayoneted. Some police officers did not bother with more time-consuming forms of torture. They simply shot any suspect who refused to answer, then told the next suspect, who had been forced to watch the cold-blooded executions, to dig his own grave. When the grave was finished, the man was asked if he would now be willing to talk. That was in the 1950s in a British colony. And that is why the movement for colonial freedom was founded, to expose that awful events and to expose the reality of what that colonial occupation was about. But it also comes from a sort of almost psychological, pathological thing of the way in which some of the British colonialists have behaved. I mean, Baden-Powell is sort of known to be the founder of the Boy Scout movement and so on. And he was a British officer in South Africa with Rhodes and others. And Rhodes, remember, was a company man, not necessarily a British colonialist. It was almost a private colony. And when asked about the way in which African people were treated, he said, "Don't infer from these remarks that I am a regular hater," and he uses the N-word. "I am not. I've met lots of good friends among them, but however good they may be, they must as a people be ruled by a hand of iron in a velvet glove." And that was the language he used. And I think it's important that we kind of understand some of these things. I just want to move on to the last part now because I've taken too long on some of this. Fenner did great work in the movement of colonial freedom, in War on Want, and in CMD. He also opposed the Vietnam War and the post-colonial world. Those colonies that gained their independence in the 1950s and 1960s did so by massive sacrifices. They did so by the inspiration of the 1945 Pan-African Unity Conference that was held in Chawton-cum-Hardy Town Hall, which was the antidote to the 1884 Congress of Berlin, which carved up Africa at the behest of the Europeans. And within 10 years, many of those, 10, 12 years, many of those people had become leaders in the countries concerned, and in the case of Nkrumah, became the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ghana. They achieved great things. But the independence wasn't necessarily the independence they thought they were going to get. The independence inherited a system that was unfair, inherited a trade system that was unfair, and moving a bit further forward, the oil crisis of 1974 did for them as it did for so many others. And we then had the World Bank and IMF moving in with structural adjustment programs and all the poverty that went with that. And so I think we just got to understand that throughout Fenner's life, he'd experienced from being at the height of empire to the point where pretty much every British colony had achieved its independence. But he recognised that independence alone wasn't the whole point. It was about international justice and international solidarity. And so I'll leave out part of what I was going to say and just conclude with these thoughts. If you look at the world today, what are the issues we face? One, it's on everybody's mind, COVID and the effects of it, and the way in which Big Pharma has made a huge amount of money out of COVID. Two is unbelievable levels of poverty and inequality for many people in the world. 1/4 of the world's population are food insecure, a sort of very nice seminar way of describing being hungry, being short of food. That's 1/4 of the world's population, and that poverty is getting worse. The inequality has grown massively during COVID and by fiat of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which goes to various countries, refuses to write off their debts, or if it does write off their debts, puts a price on it, which is always privatisation and always marketisation of their economies. And then we've had the wars. I mentioned Vietnam, we've had Afghanistan, we've had Iraq, we've had Libya, we've had Syria, and now we have the disaster of the war in the Ukraine, and that is equally a disaster like all the other wars are. Those wars create poverty, those wars eat up resources, and those wars create refugees, create hatred, create terror, and everything else that goes with it. And there are 70 million refugees around the world. Boris Johnson and our Tory government say the way forward is global Britain and Britain asserting itself. So what have they done? Increased arms expenditure to 2% of GDP, now go up to, I think, 2.7% of GDP. Increase the number of nuclear warheads we've got, and now proposing, instead of talking the language of peace in Ukraine and try and bring about a ceasefire, they're talking about pouring more and more weapons into Ukraine for a longer and longer war, and goodness knows where that will end. And at the same time, tearing up the principles behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights by producing a British Bill of Rights which will undermine all of those things. There has to be a different and better way of doing things. Surely an international strategy based on peace, based on justice, based on human rights, based on equality, and based in the belief that every human being has a right to live and a right to contribute to our world and to our society. If we're going to achieve those kind of changes, it's got to be through an understanding of history that's a bit different and a bit better that so many of our children receive in our schools. It's got to be an understanding that racism comes from the history books and comes from the tradition of colonialism and what goes with it. The greatest lesson to most people around the world in the last 5 years has been the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, because it's shown to people around the world that the slavery that destroyed the lives of millions continues to be a force for racism, not just in the USA, but in many other places around the world. It's standing up against that historical narrative. And so our purpose, surely, as committed people to a world of peace, as people committed to a world of social justice, has to be education, has to be solidarity, has to be organisation that goes with it. There's so much more and so many more colonial struggles we could have talked about, but I hope tonight's event will be a way in which we can at least begin to think about the global issues that we all face and the way that we can, united together, all of the people in all the peace movements, the left and so on, and trade unions, understand international solidarity is what matters. I'll just finish with this little anecdote. 2 weeks ago, I was in Colombia on behalf of Progressive International, observing the first round of the presidential election. And two things impressed me. One was it was actually, what I saw of it, very well run, the election process on the day. The parts I saw anyway, I've got no problem with any of those. But I also had a very interesting meeting with a group of young people who formed a trade union in Bogota of delivery riders, gig economy workers, working for exactly the same companies that gig workers are working for in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in New York. That global platform economy which gives workers no rights, which makes the workers concerned dominated and controlled by messages on their mobile phone and the times in which they get to deliver things, and they lack any employment rights whatsoever. 2,000 of them in Bogota have formed a union to fight back against that, just like unions are being formed of mainly young people all over the world to fight back against the new techno-exploitation of the new working class, which is denied any rights or any voice whatsoever. As ever, it's international solidarity that matters. As ever, it's information and sharing that information that matters. As ever, it's about listening to each other and marching down that road together to try to create that better world. Fenner did that all his life. We have to do the same and hold maximum respect to the wonders of people like Fenner Brockway, Tony Benn and others. Thank you very much for listening to me.